3 minutes. That's all it took. 3 minutes for J.D. Vance to go from being interrupted and humiliated on live national television to delivering a response that left 11 million Americans in stunned silence. The moment began with a laugh. Elizabeth Warren laughed at the story of his hometown, at the pain behind his words. A pain forged in steel mills long shut down, in families broken not by war, but by policy. She didn't expect a comeback. She didn't expect truth wrapped in restraint. But J.D. didn't raise his voice. He didn't shout. Instead, he looked straight ahead and said something so simple, so devastating, it changed the temperature in the room and the conversation across the country. This isn't a news report, it's a story, imagined in its form, but rooted in feelings many know too well. While the moments are fictional, the ache beneath them is not. So now we ask you, what would you say if the nation laughed at your pain? Because J.D. Vance didn't just answer that question. He made America listen. Don't look away. What happens next is something this country wasn't ready to hear. And so it began. What was meant to be just another televised town hall became something no scriptwriter could have predicted. As the lights dimmed and the cameras rolled, two names echoed across a packed auditorium: J.D. Vance and Elizabeth Warren. One carried policy papers, the other carried a past etched in rust and silence. Neither of them knew that what would unfold next wouldn't just be a debate, it would become a moment America couldn't unhear. The lights dimmed just enough to let the tension breathe. A sea of studio lights hovered overhead like quiet drones, capturing every twitch, every blink, every misplaced smile. Rows of audience members dressed for politics or spectacle, or both, shifted in their seats as the countdown clock on the floor ticked closer to zero. The hush wasn't peaceful. It was the hush before a storm. Live from Washington, D.C., ABC's primetime town hall debate was about to begin. Two senators, one stage, and the eyes of a divided country watching. Behind the curtain, J.D. Vance stood still. He wasn't adjusting his tie. He wasn't checking notes. He wasn't smiling. He was listening, not to the crowd, but to the silence before the show. The kind of silence you only hear if you've lived through too many years of being ignored. The moderator's voice cracked through the auditorium like a shot of caffeine. Good evening, America. Tonight we bring you two of the sharpest minds and most distinct voices in the United States Senate. A polite wave of applause followed, but it was hollow, like clapping out of habit. To my left, Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts. The crowd's reaction was familiar, strong, prepared. Her smile was calculated but warm, the kind that had opened fundraising dinners and dominated headlines for a decade. And to my right, Senator J.D. Vance of Ohio. The applause this time was uneven. Scattered cheers, some hesitation. A few camera pans showed nodding veterans, factory workers, even a steelworkers union leader sitting in row 5. Vance nodded once. No smile, no theatrics, just presence. As the camera zoomed in for the opening remarks, Warren leaned forward slightly, shoulders angled like a boxer in stance. Vance stayed motionless, his hands folded, but his eyes were fixed on the moderator like they were tracing something deeper behind the words. Then came the first question. Senator Vance, you've spoken often about what you call the collapse of working America. What exactly does that mean in real terms? And do you believe the American dream is dead? There it was, the opening pitch. J.D. leaned forward, not fast but with purpose. He didn't clear his throat. He didn't blink nervously. He just spoke. Where I come from, the American dream isn't just dead. It's buried, under a Walmart that replaced the last family-run hardware store, beneath a factory turned opioid clinic, behind a school building that now boards up windows instead of shaping futures. He paused, but not for applause, for weight. They say we're hollowed-out towns, but what hollowed us out wasn't failure. It was being forgotten. Camera 2 cut to Warren. She wasn't smiling now. J.D. continued. You call it evolution. We call it erasure. Not just of jobs, but of dignity. My father worked 30 years in steel before his hands shook too hard to drive. My friend Eli came home from war to a town that couldn't remember his name. If that's progress, I'll take the past. The audience was still. No one expected that answer. Not so early, not so raw, not so personal. A cough echoed from somewhere in the back of the room, oddly loud. A journalist in the third row furiously typed, eyes darting from Vance to Warren. Someone backstage mouthed, "We're only 5 minutes in." Then from the moderator, "Senator Warren, your response?" She leaned into the mic. Her voice was smooth, practiced, polished, but her eyes flickered with something unspoken. Surprise? Offense? Strategy? She opened her mouth and interrupted. But what she said and how he answered would set off a chain reaction that no one in the room or in the country could have predicted. Warren didn't wait for the moderator to cue her. She didn't hesitate, didn't soften her tone with courtesy or preamble. She simply leaned in, clipped her words short, and sliced through the moment. "You dramatized decline. America is not broken. It's evolving." The line hung in the air like a lit match. Within seconds, the studio rippled with polite laughter, sharp, knowing, and just loud enough to feel like mockery. A few heads turned toward Warren with smirks of affirmation, the kind of response she'd grown used to in academia and on the Senate floor. The kind that says, "You said what everyone was thinking." But J.D. Vance didn't move. No flash of indignation, no rebuttal tumbling out in defense. Just a flicker, barely visible, in the tightness of his jaw. A pause, a breath held too long. His right thumb tapped the pad of his index finger once, like someone trying to hold something in that didn't want to stay buried. The moderator hesitated, glancing sideways as if unsure whether to steer the moment forward or let it hang. For a fraction of a second, no one knew who would speak next. Then J.D. leaned into the mic, not rushed, not shaken, and spoke in a tone so still it cut louder than anything that had come before. "I come from where America already fell." The words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. They carried something else entirely. Finality. Like the sound a door makes when it closes behind you and you know you're not going back. The crowd's laughter died instantly. The room's temperature shifted. Even the cameras seemed to freeze on his face, lingering as if trying to capture not just his expression, but the weight behind his silence. No dramatic music, no gasps. Just the kind of quiet that only happens when truth cuts through noise. The producers in the control booth didn't speak. One just gestured to the director, mouthing, "Stay on him. Don't cut." Warren adjusted in her seat, the corner of her confident smile dimming, not into shame, but something more unsettled. It was the look of a fighter who landed a punch and realized it wasn't a bruise she left. It was a scar she couldn't see coming. And still, J.D. didn't blink. For viewers watching at home, the clip had already begun its journey. Smartphones in laps and laptops on coffee tables lit up with screenshots of his face. That line in bold captions, "I come from where America already fell." Within minutes, someone turned it into a tweet. Another clipped it for TikTok. An Army veteran in West Virginia messaged his son, "You need to hear what Vance just said." Back in the studio, the moderator cleared his throat, attempting to reclaim order, but the balance had shifted. The rules of the exchange had changed. J.D. Vance didn't just answer a question, he exposed a fracture. And for the first time in that debate, the room didn't feel like a forum. It felt like a reckoning. And what came next, no one, not even J.D. himself, could have predicted. The silence in the studio hadn't even faded before the noise outside began to rise. In a control room 2 floors above the stage, a young producer stared at her screen, eyes locked on a live feed chat window ticking faster than she could read. J.D.'s words, "I come from where America already fell," had been clipped, captioned, and reposted across 5 platforms in under 90 seconds. One intern whispered, "We just broke the algorithm." The others didn't respond. They were too busy watching the numbers climb. By the time J.D. stepped off stage, the moment had already left the building. In the hallway behind the curtain, the buzz of fluorescent lights felt louder than applause. He didn't look for anyone. He didn't need to. His phone was already vibrating, once, twice, and then continuously, as if the world was calling all at once. Texts, missed calls, alerts, mentions, screenshots, and one message from his wife. Whatever you just did, it hit people. Hard. He didn't reply. Not yet. Far away in a small bar outside Chillicothe, Ohio, the debate played on a dusty flat screen mounted above the bar taps. The picture flickered occasionally, but the sound was clear enough. Half a dozen regulars sat nursing the kind of drinks you pour when you're not in a hurry to leave. A few had their backs to the screen until they heard Warren's laugh. And then they turned. By the time JD spoke, "I come from where America already fell," no one said a word, not even the bartender. Just one man, a retired Marine with a faded eagle tattoo on his forearm, leaned in and whispered, "He just said what we've lived." Back on Twitter, the hashtag where America fell first began to rise. A teacher in Indiana posted a clip with the caption, "I'm playing this in class tomorrow. Every student should hear it." A factory foreman in Michigan tweeted, "Been waiting 30 years for someone to say this out loud." A woman in West Virginia posted an old photo of her father outside a closed coal mine with the words, "This is where it started. This is what JD meant." It wasn't just politics anymore. It was memory, recognition, a shared ache finding its voice. Cable news scrambled. CNN looped the moment on repeat, dissecting every word like it was part of a legal deposition. Fox News called it the first real moment of honesty this election cycle. MSNBC cut to Warren's response, but the audience online had already moved on. They weren't debating, they were resonating. JD stood alone backstage, still holding his phone, as a campaign aide rushed up beside him breathless. "Sir, there's press waiting. You're on every major outlet right now. Do you want to respond?" He didn't look up. Respond to what? The reaction. People are saying, well, they're saying this changed everything. He nodded more to himself than to her. "I didn't say anything new." "Maybe not," the aide said carefully, "but you said it where they could hear you." He turned toward the end of the hallway where the voices from the studio were fading into echoes. He thought of the factories, the funerals, the silence that had followed every shuttered window, every ignored letter, every speech about progress that never reached the people who paid its price. This wasn't a victory, it was a wound reopened. But for the first time in years, it wasn't bleeding alone. He slipped his phone into his pocket and started walking, not toward the cameras but toward the side exit. No entourage, no interviews. Just the sound of America waking up to a sentence it hadn't heard before, but somehow always knew. But before that silence echoed across the nation, it had lived for years in one boy's heart. Long before he had a microphone, long before anyone cared to listen. To understand the man who stood on that stage, we must first return to where his voice was born. In a town where factories died, families broke, and a young JD Vance learned what collapse really looked like. Long before the cameras, long before the debate stage and the silence he commanded, there was a boy in Middletown, Ohio, who learned early that hope was a fragile thing, and when it cracked, it didn't make a sound. JD remembered the day his father came home without a lunchbox. It was always the lunchbox, rusted, dented, stickered with decals from decades ago that let them know everything was still okay. That day he walked in empty-handed. No one said anything at first. His mom sat at the kitchen table with a cigarette that had burned itself out between her fingers. The TV was on, but no one was watching it. Just a game show host's voice bouncing off the chipped wallpaper, trying to sound cheerful in a house that had run out of joy. Later that night, JD heard his parents arguing behind a thin wall. His dad said, "It's temporary," but his voice cracked halfway through the lie. His mom said nothing for a long time. Then something else broke, a plate maybe, or her heart. The layoffs hit the whole town like a slow-moving storm. One plant closed, then another, then the one his uncle worked at. The grocery store raised prices. Gas stations stopped hiring. Friends disappeared, not all at once, but in pieces. First, they stopped showing up to school. Then someone said they were working nights. Then someone else said they weren't working at all. JD's best friend Lucas joined the Army when they were 17. JD remembered the way he stood at the bus stop in borrowed boots, pretending to be excited. "At least I'll get out of here," he said with a forced grin. JD never saw him again. His other friend Ray didn't leave. He just stopped coming around. The last time JD saw him, Ray was leaning against the back wall of the convenience store, eyes glassy, arms crossed tight against the November wind. He looked older than 19. He looked finished. Then came his mom's worst night. He found her on the bathroom floor, pale, her lips tinged blue. The pill bottle, half full just 2 days before, was empty, tipped over like it had simply given up. He was 15. He didn't scream. He just called 911 and waited by the door. She survived, but something in her didn't come back. At school, the hallways got quieter. Art class was canceled. Then music. Then field trips. The principal said the budget had been redirected, but no one knew where it went. Teachers began leaving like passengers on a sinking ship, one resignation letter at a time. There were moments JD would sit by his bedroom window at night, watching the empty streetlights flicker, wondering if this was the part where something would change, where someone would fix it. But no one came. No rescue. No speeches. Just silence. He never said any of this on the debate stage. He never needed to, because when Elizabeth Warren laughed, she didn't just dismiss a sentence. She dismissed a childhood, a town, a truth. And when JD said, "I come from where America already fell," he wasn't quoting policy. He was remembering a kitchen without laughter, a school without music, a mother without light in her eyes. Eli came home in winter. It wasn't the kind of homecoming with balloons at the airport or tearful reunions and televised parades. There were no cameras, no welcome signs, just a duffel bag, a cracked windshield, and a ride from the airport that JD insisted on giving himself. They hadn't spoken in nearly 3 years. The boy JD used to know had a laugh that filled every hallway, a quick wit and a temper that sometimes got him into trouble, but never got him lost. The man that stepped into JD's car that night was thinner, older somehow, though they were born the same spring. His eyes didn't move much. They just held a kind of stillness that made JD keep the music off for the whole drive. They passed the old diner where they'd once skipped school to split a plate of fries. It was boarded up now. Eli didn't look at it. He didn't look at much of anything. "What's next?" JD asked, not to pry, but to offer something. "Anything." Eli shrugged. "Still figuring it out. VA's backed up. Applied for work at the scrapyard, but they're not hiring? Said I'm overqualified, whatever that means." JD didn't respond. He gripped the wheel a little tighter. Eli stayed in town for 6 months, long enough for neighbors to stop asking how he was doing, and for the VA to keep sending letters with more forms, but no appointments. He lived in his uncle's basement, picked up shifts when he could. Some nights JD would find him parked outside the high school football field, engine off, just sitting there. They talked sometimes about the war, about the guys who didn't come back, about the ones who did but never really did. But one day, Eli stopped returning texts. The last time JD saw him, Eli was sitting on the curb outside the post office, head in his hands. JD pulled over, but before he could say anything, Eli waved him off with a weak smile and said, "I'm good, man. Just thinking." He wasn't good. A week later, JD got the call. No details, just that Eli had been found in the garage. Engine running, door closed, dog tags still in the front seat. The funeral was small. JD stood near the back, behind Eli's high school coach and the pastor who'd married his parents. The folded flag was handed to Eli's mother, who accepted it with hands that barely held steady. There were no news crews, no eulogies from senators, no ceremonies in marble halls, just dirt and silence. Weeks passed before JD could bring himself to visit the grave alone. He stood there for a long time, the wind scraping dry leaves across the stone like whispers. He traced Eli's name with one hand, reading it slowly as if making sure it was really there. Beneath it, someone had etched the words, "Beloved son, brother, friend." But that wasn't enough. Not for what he had endured. Not for what had failed him. JD crouched down, resting his hand against the cool granite. His voice didn't rise. It barely moved. "You didn't fall in battle. You fell in the silence afterward." He stayed there a while, talking softly about nothing, about everything. When he finally stood to leave, he didn't cry. He didn't rage. He just looked out at the rows of headstones, so many of them from the same decade, the same war, the same story that no one wanted to hear. Eli wasn't the only one. He was just the one JD never stopped caring. After Eli's funeral, JD stopped speaking for a while, but he started writing. Not as a senator, not even as an aspiring one, just as a man trying to make sense of the silence that kept burying people he loved. It started with one page, a single late-night paragraph typed in the corner of his cluttered kitchen, while the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a freight train kept him company. He wrote about the plant that closed, about the teachers who left, about the way funerals in Middletown had become more common than weddings. He wrote about how people like Eli were trained for war, but never taught how to survive being forgotten by the country they fought for. No politics, no slogans, just the truth, as plainly as he could write it. He sent the essay to 3 local papers. None responded. He posted it to a personal blog, buried behind recipes, product reviews, and half-finished short stories. It got 17 views in the first week. One comment from someone who called him another whiner romanticizing failure. He almost deleted it, but he didn't. He kept writing, a new piece every few weeks. Some were memories, the broken window in his high school gym that no one ever fixed, the neighborhood where all the mailboxes leaned the same way, like tired men after a long shift. Others were portraits of his mother's laugh before the pills, of his friend Lucas leaving for the army with a bag too small to carry what he didn't yet know he'd lose. He never expected anyone to care. That wasn't the point. But slowly, quietly, people began to notice. A community college professor in Dayton assigned one of his essays to her sociology class. A steelworker's Facebook page reposted another, adding, "This guy gets it." One night, a stranger emailed him a 5-line message with no subject line. It said, "I thought I was the only one who remembered how it felt to be erased. Thank you." That message stayed with him, not because it was poetic, but because it was familiar. Over time, JD realized something strange. It wasn't the pain that drew people in. It was the accuracy, the shared detail, the emotional muscle memory of watching a place disappear without anyone outside it noticing. He wasn't documenting decline. He was naming something people had carried silently for years. He looked back at what he'd written and thought about all the times people had told him to move on, to stop clinging to a version of America that didn't exist anymore. But they were wrong. It did exist. It still existed. In broken towns and boarded-up storefronts, in overgrown baseball fields and church parking lots with more empty pews than full ones. It existed in the people who never asked for pity, only to be acknowledged. JD stared at his keyboard one night and whispered to no one, "We didn't ask for pity. We just wanted to be seen." That line never made it into a published essay, but it stayed in his heart. And when he sat on that stage, years later, under hot lights, across from Senator Elizabeth Warren, it wasn't policy or politics that came out of his mouth. It was that same line, distilled to something even simpler, something unforgettable. "I come from where America already fell." And finally, they were listening. The debate had barely ended when the room at Harvard lit up with backslaps and clinking glasses. It wasn't an official war room, more like an elite echo chamber with better lighting and leather chairs. The setting was polished, academic, and casually powerful. High ceilings, curated bookshelves, coffee served in ceramic, not paper. They called it the Civic Strategy Lab, but it was Warren's home turf, her people, her intellectual ground zero. Around the long oak table, staffers leaned over glowing laptops, refreshing social media feeds, swapping early headlines. Warren shuts down populist narrative. Senator ends town hall with commanding tone. Vance rattled early in heated exchange. A digital heat map pulsed red over New York, Boston, San Francisco, coastal strongholds where her name still carried weight. Her lead strategist, a graying man in tortoiseshell glasses and an ironic MIT hoodie, stood with arms crossed, watching the clip on loop for the 3rd time. "There," he said, pointing to the exact second she cut JD off. "That's the moment. You controlled the frame. He got personal. You got presidential. You owned him." There were chuckles, nods of approval. Someone offered a toast. To evolution over collapse. Elizabeth Warren accepted the glass but didn't drink. Her smile was present, but polite, an obligatory expression worn like a pin. She nodded as the praise rolled in, but her eyes kept drifting back to the screen, where the moment replayed again. Her laugh, his stillness, that line. I come from where America already fell. It was strange, she thought, not what he said, but how quiet the audience became afterward. Not stunned, not confused, just still, as if something unspoken had been said aloud for the first time, and no one knew how to follow it. She reached for the remote and paused the clip at the exact frame where JD's face looked straight into the camera. Expressionless, unreadable, but undeniably rooted. It wasn't political theater. It wasn't even strategic. It was lived in. Her communications director broke the silence. Cable panels are loving it. Your framing came across as optimistic. You reframed decline as evolution. It was textbook. Textbook, she echoed almost absently. The strategist caught the shift in her tone. Senator? Warren glanced up. Nothing. Just, it played different in the room. What do you mean? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she turned back to the screen. The pause button framed JD in mid-sentence, just after she interrupted him, just before the atmosphere turned. I've debated dozens of men like him, she said finally. Angry, rehearsed, out to perform outrage. He wasn't that. He didn't react. He let the silence do the work. There was a pause around the table, a subtle tension. Her staff wasn't used to this side of her, the side that doubted her own wins. Senator, the strategist said carefully, we can't get sentimental about tone. You delivered the policy case. He delivered a monologue. He delivered memory, she corrected. That's different. No one replied. The room didn't shift course. The narrative machine was already in motion. Talking points scheduled, press appearances lined up, newsletters drafted with subject lines like hope over fear. But Elizabeth Warren, seasoned and sharp, had been in the game long enough to know when something slipped beneath the surface. And tonight, something had. The headlines might crown her the victor. But that one line, I come from where America already fell, had lodged itself somewhere deeper. Not because it was clever, not because it was loud, because it wasn't meant for her. It was meant for the people who didn't watch the debate at all, because they were too tired, too broke, or too forgotten to care. And somehow, she suspected, they heard it anyway. The welcome sign at the edge of Middletown was still chipped, still leaning 5 degrees to the left. Welcome to Middletown. Proud past, promising future, it read, though someone had once crossed out promising with a permanent marker and scribbled postponed beneath it. JD noticed it hadn't been cleaned up. He didn't expect it to be. He parked a little off Main Street near the corner diner that still smelled like burnt coffee and bacon grease. The paint was peeling. The booths hadn't changed in 2 decades. Neither had Carol, the waitress who had worked there since his teenage years. She spotted him before he even stepped inside. Well, well, if it ain't our local TV star, she said, voice warm but laced with that familiar sarcasm working-class women used as armor. He smiled genuinely. Hey, Carol. Before he could say more, she walked out from behind the counter, pulled him into a hug and whispered in his ear, they laugh at us until they need our votes. He nodded into her shoulder. That sentence said more than any segment on cable news ever had. Over coffee, black, no cream, he listened as she talked about the new mayor, the failed grant application, the bakery that closed last spring. She never once mentioned the debate. She didn't need to. Middletown had seen enough speeches. What mattered here wasn't what made headlines. It was what made it through the month. When he stood to leave, Carol grabbed his wrist gently. You said it plain, honey. Just don't let him pretty it up. The truth doesn't need polish. JD promised nothing. He just squeezed her hand once and walked back out into the pale light of an Ohio afternoon that looked like every afternoon he remembered. Gray, wide, quiet. His childhood home was a small 2-bedroom box with a porch that had always leaned too far forward, like it was trying to collapse into the lawn. It wasn't his anymore. He'd sold it when his mother passed, but the new owners still let him stop by when he was in town. Inside, the kitchen still held the same table. His mother's old ceramic ashtray still sat on the counter, even though no one smoked anymore. In the living room, he found the envelope. It had been forwarded from his office in D.C., a plain white envelope with a shaky return address. M. Jenkins, Eli's mom. He sat down slowly before opening it. Her handwriting was delicate, deliberate, like each word cost her something. J.D., I watched the debate. I wasn't planning to. I don't usually bother. But someone told me you were going to be on, and I thought, maybe I should see what you've become. When she laughed, I heard what Eli would have heard. And when you answered, I heard what he never got to say. Thank you for not yelling, for not forgetting, for carrying him, even when the rest of the country didn't notice he was gone. He would have been proud of you. I am too. Martha J.D. folded the letter slowly and placed it on the table beside the coffee mug. He stared at it for a long time, not blinking, barely breathing. Because in Washington, they talked about legacy. They drafted it in policy memos and carved it into talking points. But here in Middletown, legacy was something smaller, quieter. It was a handwritten letter left on a kitchen table and a truth spoken once, cleanly, when the world least expected it. And somehow that meant more than all the headlines put together. The chalk made a soft tapping sound against the board, like rain trying to get someone's attention. Today, said Mrs. O'Hara, adjusting her glasses, we're not starting with the textbook. It was third period civics at a high school tucked into the flat quiet of rural Kansas, the kind of school where classrooms still smelled faintly of old paper and lemon floor polish, and where the American flag in the corner wasn't just decoration, it was dusted every Monday morning by a student on rotation. Most of her students were half listening, still shaking off the drag of the early bell, until she dimmed the lights and rolled the cart forward, the one with the clunky monitor and the blinking blue HDMI cord. On the screen, the town hall debate flickered to life. Some students perked up, others slouched deeper into their hoodies. But when Elizabeth Warren interrupted J.D. Vance, and especially when he answered, the atmosphere changed. Subtle, but definite. No one laughed, no one whispered. Then came the line. That line. I come from where America already fell. Mrs. O'Hara paused the clip. She didn't need to say anything. The room held its breath for her. It was Derek near the back, who finally spoke first. I trust him, he said, not loudly, but without hesitation. He's been where I live. A few heads turned, but no one laughed. Derek wasn't the kind of student people usually noticed. He wore the same 2 jackets on rotation. He was quiet, never raised his hand unless he had to. His dad worked nights at the grain elevator and had been laid off twice in the past year. His mom cleaned houses. His uncle had died of fentanyl. Derek didn't talk about it, but everyone kind of knew. Mrs. O'Hara nodded. That's why we study rhetoric and politics, not just for facts, but for truth. Not everyone who speaks carries the same weight. Some people carry silence with them, and when they speak from it, you feel it. She turned back to the board and slowly, in careful block letters, began writing. I come from where America already fell. Then beneath it, a second line. What does it mean to speak from memory, not strategy? The students watched her, but none reached for their notebooks right away. It was that kind of moment, one that didn't ask for reaction, just reflection. Outside, a tractor passed by on the 2-lane road that led to the school. The windows rattled slightly. Inside, it was still. Mrs. O'Hara stepped away from the board and turned back to the room. You won't find that sentence in your exam review packet, she said, but I promise, it matters more. The bell wouldn't ring for another 20 minutes, but no one asked to leave early. No one even pulled out their phones. One girl raised her hand. Was it scripted? No, the teacher said, almost whispering, and that's why it worked. Back in D.C., newsrooms were still debating policy angles. Editorials were being drafted, poll numbers recalculated. But in that Kansas classroom, something else was happening. Not debate, not politics, just understanding. A sentence had made it across the divide, coast to cornfield, studio to school, and it hadn't lost a single ounce of meaning along the way. And in that silence, it started to mean even more. The steel plant didn't have a name anymore. The sign that once stood tall above the main gate had fallen at some point. Maybe from wind, maybe from neglect. Now it lay in the overgrown grass, half buried in weeds, its metal frame warped like it had been trying to bend its way out of history. JD stepped through a chain-link opening where the gate used to hang. The crunch of gravel under his boots echoed across the empty yard, like someone trying not to wake the past. This place used to breathe. That's what his dad would say, usually over a beer, usually on nights when he missed it too much to stay quiet. It breathed like a beast. You'd hear her before the sun even came up. Steam, steel, sweat. She lived and we lived with her. Now she was silent. The windows were punched out like missing teeth. Rust clung to the steel beams overhead like old blood. Sunlight pierced through cracks in the roof in narrow golden slashes, falling onto the dust that floated like ash. Pigeons had moved in where foremen once shouted. The paint had blistered off the walls. Everything smelled like metal and mold and memory. JD moved slowly, carefully, like the building might remember him. He passed the lunchroom, now filled with splintered benches and ceiling tiles collapsed onto the floor like a mouth that had finally given up speaking. He passed the stairwell where he once waited for his father after double shifts, reading comic books while men with grease-stained hands nodded at him, always calling him Bobby's boy. Finally, he turned down a narrow corridor and stopped. There it was, third locker from the left. Bob Vance, still stenciled in faded white letters across the top. The corners were rusted through, and someone had tagged the lower half with graffiti years ago. But the name was untouched. Like even the vandals had decided some things were better left alone. JD reached out and touched it, slowly, reverently. The metal was cold, but not empty. It pulsed with what used to be. He remembered the sound of his father's boots walking this very corridor. The way he'd opened this locker like a ritual, pack of smokes in the top corner, black and white photo of JD taped to the inside of the door, lunch wrapped in tin foil beside a folded Reds cap. He remembered the smell, the heat, the oil-stained denim. He remembered pride that had nothing to do with politics and everything to do with showing up. Now there was nothing, just this shell, this carcass of industry, this once living thing. JD closed his eyes and stood still for a moment, letting the silence speak. Not the kind of silence that comes from peace, but the kind that follows a scream no one answered. He opened the locker. It creaked. Inside, the only thing left was a single work glove. Leather, cracked, curled at the fingers, like it was still waiting to be worn. He didn't take it. He just stared at it, his breath slow even. This was what they never understood in DC. This wasn't nostalgia. This wasn't romanticizing the past. It wasn't about steel or jobs or even economics. It was about the hollowed-out places, not just buildings, but men, families, towns. It was about everything that disappears when no one is watching. JD closed the locker door softly, the echo ringing down the corridor like the final note of a forgotten anthem. And as he turned to leave, he didn't look back. Because some ghosts don't need witnesses. They just need someone to remember they were real. The auditorium at MIT gleamed. Bright track lighting glinted off polished wood floors, and every seat was filled with tailored blazers, pressed blouses, and the kind of note-taking posture that signaled minds sharpened by academia. The air buzzed with anticipation, not just for answers, but for affirmation. These were the kind of rooms Elizabeth Warren had learned to command long before she'd set foot in the Senate. The event was billed as a keynote on economic transformation in post-industrial America. The lecture hall was fitted with 3 cameras, a live stream feed, and a stage background that read, "Tomorrow's Labor, Building Progress Through Policy." Warren stepped to the podium in a cobalt blue blazer, hands resting easily on the acrylic stand. Her voice, when it came, was crisp, confident, and measured to fill the room without sounding forced. "Progress is painful, but necessary," she began. "We don't get to tomorrow by clinging to the memory of yesterday." Nods rippled through the audience. Her slide presentation clicked forward with phrases like technological acceleration, modern economic ecosystems, and repositioning the American labor force. From her vantage point, Warren saw a sea of agreement, eager faces, open laptops, a few students whispering admiration. She was hitting every rhetorical mark, framing decline as evolution, recasting job loss as workforce fluidity, turning displacement into narrative opportunity. What she didn't see, at least not at first, was the woman in row 7. Her name was Helen Wright, 63 years old, widow of a veteran. She had driven 3 hours from Western Massachusetts to be here, not because she followed Warren's policies closely, but because her late husband had believed in duty and discourse, and she still tried to honor that where she could. Helen sat through the first 20 minutes silently, hands folded in her lap, lips drawn tight. She didn't take notes. She didn't clap. When the phrase post-industrial America flashed across the screen for the third time, she reached down quietly, picked up her purse, and stood. Her movement was slow, careful, not disruptive, but noticeable. A student near her glanced over. Then another. Someone in the back raised a brow, but no one said anything. They simply watched as she walked up the aisle, coat folded over one arm, back straight as if she were walking out of church. Not in protest, but in mourning. Warren noticed her just as the woman reached the exit. Their eyes met for the briefest second, not long enough for recognition, but just long enough for a flicker of confusion to pass across Warren's face. Helen didn't flinch. She just pushed the door open and slipped into the hallway, leaving the applause and analytics behind her. Back on stage, Warren recovered quickly. She moved into her final talking points, emphasizing education, innovation, the long game. She quoted Roosevelt. She called for boldness. And the room responded exactly as it was supposed to. But something stuck. After the event, in the quiet of the green room, Warren sat with a glass of water and stared down at her notes. She knew the material was solid. She knew the policy held. But her mind kept going back to the woman with the gray hair and lined hands, in the way she'd left without a sound. Warren didn't know her name. She didn't know her story. But something about her presence, her absence, had pierced the speech more sharply than any question could. For all the data, for all the charts and framing, there were still people walking away. And Warren, despite her intellect, couldn't quite explain why that mattered so much. Not yet. The letter came on a Wednesday morning. No stamp, just metered mail from somewhere along the Appalachian stretch of southeastern Kentucky. JD's chief of staff had dropped it on the stack without much thought. Another envelope among dozens piled on the oak table in the corner of his office. Most were standard, typed questions, newsletters, a few typed rants. But this one was handwritten, pale blue ink on plain cream paper, the handwriting slanted and careful. He opened it after lunch, more out of instinct than intention. There were no return address labels, no email inside, no hashtags or slogans. Just 4 short paragraphs from someone who hadn't planned to write at all, but couldn't not. He read it once, then again, then he stood. JD walked down the hallway toward the team room without saying anything. Inside, a few junior aides were hunched over laptops, drafting responses, prepping town hall materials, debating talking points for upcoming interviews. They stopped when they saw his face. He didn't say hello. He just held up the letter, cleared his throat, and read, "Dear Senator Vance, you don't know me. I'm just a single mom from Pikeville. I've never written a politician before. Don't really know the rules. But after watching that debate, I needed to say something. When that woman laughed, when she cut you off, I heard something I've heard too many times. I heard someone telling me and my son that our story isn't serious enough to matter. He's 17. He fixes lawnmowers. He stayed behind to take care of his grandfather instead of going to college. He's got hands rougher than most men twice his age. And when you said that line, I come from where America already fell, he didn't say anything. He just nodded, once, like he finally heard someone speak our language. So thank you for not flinching, for not fighting fire with fire, for not letting them tell us that survival isn't noble. I don't know politics, but I know truth when I hear it. Amanda J., Pikeville, Kentucky." When JD finished, the room stayed quiet. One of the aides, barely out of grad school, whispered, That's different." Another looked up. "How many of these have we gotten?" His chief of staff tapped her tablet. "Since the debate? Nearly 4,000. They're still coming in. Letters, emails, voicemails, even hand-delivered ones." JD looked down at the page in his hand again, eyes lingering on the phrase he just nodded. Not shouted, not posted. just nodded. That's who we're speaking to, he said. That's who heard us. He sat down at the table, suddenly decisive. Let's start compiling them. All of them. For a newsletter? One staffer asked. No, he said. For something real. He didn't elaborate, and he didn't have to. They understood. These weren't just thank you notes or policy critiques. They were entries in a ledger of lives that rarely made it past the first line of a headline. Voices not trained in perfect grammar or eloquent phrasing, but soaked in truth. Within an hour, the intern staff had set up a folder called Letters from the Hollowed Out Places. By evening, it was filling fast. One aide suggested they forward some to the press. Another offered to create a video montage. But JD waved them off for now. This isn't for virality, he said. It's for history. He picked up Amanda's letter once more, carefully folding it and placing it in his inner jacket pocket. Because not every moment needs a podium. Some just need to be carried. At first, the letters came in slow, a few dozen each morning, then hundreds, then boxes. By the end of the week, JD's office in D.C. had to clear out the break room just to make space for the stacks. Cardboard bins filled with envelopes of every color, weight, and scent. Some were typed with formal headers. Others were scribbled in pencil on the backs of receipts, napkins, church bulletins. There were postcards from rusted towns, folded notebook pages from kitchen counters, and envelopes sealed with stickers or duct tape. They arrived from the corners of the country that never made campaign maps, tiny dots with names like Driftwood, Siler City, Grayson Hollow. No zip code recognition needed. JD knew exactly where they came from, because they came from the same place he had. The letters were quiet, honest, some angry, most tired. One man from a trailer park in southern Indiana wrote, I didn't think anyone up there remembered us, but I heard you, and I ain't forgot what it's like to matter, even for one sentence. Another from a grandmother in Idaho simply read, My husband passed last year. You said what he would have said if someone had listened to him before he left. JD read everyone he could. His staff tried to filter, to sort by topic, veterans, job loss, health care, opioids, but he told them to stop. They're not categories, he said. They're people. The office printer was repurposed as a makeshift scanner. Aides worked late, cataloging by date, city, emotion. The press began to ask about them, sensing a story. JD gave no interviews. There was no strategy memo, no media rollout. Just a quiet wall on the far side of his office where he began taping the letters, one by one. By the second week, it was full. Aide after aide offered to digitize them, frame them, make it look more curated. JD refused. They weren't written to be curated, he said. They were written to be heard. So the wall stayed raw, taped corners curling, uneven lines, overlapping stories. The letters layered like scars. Not organized, but alive. One night, long after the others had left, JD stood alone in the dim hallway, looking at the wall. He ran his fingers across a letter from a young, single father in Oklahoma who worked 3 part-time jobs and still couldn't afford gas for his truck. They say we're angry, but we're not. We're just invisible. You made us feel seen for 3 minutes. That's more than I've gotten in 30 years. 3 minutes. That phrase kept coming back. 3 minutes on live TV, and something had cracked open. Not a policy debate, but a wound this country had papered over with slogans and quarterly reports. JD leaned against the doorframe, eyes scanning the collage of pain and perseverance, and whispered to himself, this is what they never prepared for. Not protest, not outrage, recognition, the quiet kind. The kind that doesn't need to scream because it's carried in the weight of being finally, mercifully acknowledged. He reached into his desk drawer, pulled out a fresh roll of tape, and added another letter to the wall. A short one, barely 10 words long. I watched that debate with my daughter. We cried together. He didn't know the sender's name. It didn't matter, because this wasn't about applause. It wasn't about going viral. It was about building a wall not out of stone, but out of stories that refused to be buried any longer. And JD knew deep in his bones that long after the headlines moved on, this wall would still be standing. 2 days after the debate, the National Veterans Union released an official statement. Printed in bold at the top of the page, "That man didn't shout, but we heard him louder than anyone." The quote exploded online. It was shared not by politicians, but by soldiers, widows, and sons of steelworkers. Veterans groups from North Carolina to Nebraska reposted it over weathered photos, combat boots on porches, folded flags on mantles, VA clinic signs peeling under rusted roofs. It wasn't about who won the debate. It was about who remembered them. JD didn't respond publicly. He didn't schedule interviews or tweet about it. Instead, he canceled 3 media appearances and quietly drove 4 hours west to a brick veterans center in rural Kentucky. No staff, no camera crew, just him and a duffel bag with a stack of thank you letters he'd written by hand. The center was tucked behind a shuttered bowling alley and an abandoned car wash, signs of a town that once buzzed and now just blinked. Inside, the air smelled like old leather and black coffee. Posters of past wars lined the wood-paneled walls. JD walked in like a man entering a family reunion he didn't know he needed. A retired Marine spotted him first. No salute, just a slow nod. Then came the ripple. A Vietnam vet stood up from a chessboard and walked over, arms crossed. "That thing you said," he began. His voice cracked before he could finish. JD didn't say anything. He just opened his arms. The man stepped into the hug like he'd been waiting decades. There were no microphones to catch the moment. No statements prepared. Just tears from a place deeper than words. One woman, her hair in a tight gray bun, handed JD a photograph of her husband in uniform. She whispered, "He died waiting for a system that never saw him." JD looked her in the eye and said, "He was never invisible." Not to me. They talked for hours, not about politics, but about broken hips and missed benefits, the shame of asking for help, and the pride that made it so hard. JD listened more than he spoke. He asked about their kids, their towns, their favorite barbecues before everything changed. When he stood to leave, a younger vet, probably no older than 30, called out, "Hey, sir, you remember us. That's what matters." JD nodded once, then paused at the door. "I don't want to be remembered for a soundbite," he said. "I want to be remembered for listening." As he left, a staffer at the front desk handed him a small folded American flag. It was frayed at the edges. "One of the guys wanted you to have this," she said. He took it carefully, like it might fall apart in his hands. Later that night, back at his apartment, JD placed the flag next to his office wall of letters. He didn't hang it. He just let it rest. Between a note from a coal miner's widow and a birthday card from a 4th grade class in Akron. He stared at it for a long time. This wasn't legacy. Not yet. This was what came before legacy. The part no one puts in memoirs. A quiet moment. A shared truth. A country, wounded, tired, proud, whispering through its veterans. We're still here. The clip from the town hall had gone viral, but not just on news feeds. It traveled by email chains, community Facebook groups, and PTA newsletters. It wasn't JD Vance's name that stuck. It was his line. "I come from where America already fell." In schools across Ohio, Iowa, and Indiana, civics teachers paused their regular curriculum. They dimmed the lights and hit play. Not for policy analysis, but because something real had cracked through the noise. In a middle school outside Des Moines, Mrs. Lannister, a woman with silver-streaked hair and a denim skirt, stood in front of a room of 7th graders. The screen flickered as JD's face came into focus. Tight jaw, controlled voice, eyes that had seen too much. The room, usually filled with restless energy, fell into stillness. After the clip ended, Mrs. Lannister said nothing at first. She just wrote on the whiteboard, "Where did America fall for you?" A long pause. Then a boy near the back, hoodie pulled halfway over his head, mumbled, "When my dad left and never came back." A girl to his left added, "When the plant closed." "My mom's still waiting on that job to come back." Another voice whispered, "My uncle cries at night." I didn't know it was okay to talk about that. Mrs. Lannister's voice was calm. "It is." That moment rippled, not just in that classroom, but across dozens of others. In a high school in Michigan, a student taped JD's quote above the chalkboard. Another brought a letter her grandfather had written from Vietnam but never sent. She read it aloud. The teacher cried. In rural Missouri, a civics class wrote anonymous confessions of loss and hope, dropping them into a shoebox labeled "The Heart of This Place." What had started as a political clash had become a cultural reset. J.D. hadn't just challenged Warren. He had named a pain that many had never dared to say out loud, especially not in front of others. It wasn't about left or right anymore. It was about the quiet, the silences at dinner tables, the unopened envelopes from the VA, the train tracks that once carried fathers to jobs and now carried nothing but dust. One teacher in Illinois said, "It was the first time I saw my class understand that politics isn't just noise, it's personal." In the days that followed, hundreds of schools sent postcards to JD's office. Some were crayon-scribbled notes. Others were printed reflections with school logos and staff signatures. One stood out, from a fourth-grade class in Muncie, Indiana. "Dear Mr. Vance, we watched your video. Our teacher said you were brave. Some of us feel invisible, too. But we want to be helpers when we grow up. Thank you for saying where you came from. It helps us be proud of ours." JD kept that one in a frame, not for the message, for the truth behind it. This wasn't about winning debates anymore. It was about what kids felt when the noise faded, when someone, for once, didn't speak over them, but for them. Back in Des Moines, Mrs. Lannister ended her class the way she always did, with one final question. Who do we listen to, and why? This time, no one answered right away. They were still thinking, still feeling, still learning that sometimes the most powerful voices don't yell, they reveal. The clip hadn't just gone viral, it had burrowed into the national consciousness. 3 weeks later, ABC News released a public statement. By overwhelming public demand, Senators J.D. Vance and Elizabeth Warren are invited to return for a follow-up debate. Live next Sunday night. It wasn't a request, it was an event. The headlines called it the rematch. Editorials speculated whether Warren would even accept. Social media split itself into camps, each sharpening their knives. Inside a quiet office in D.C., Elizabeth Warren sat at her desk, a legal pad in front of her filled with handwritten notes, some of them crossed out in frustration. Her aide, Malcolm, hovered nearby. "You don't have to do this," he said cautiously. Warren tapped the cap of her pen, eyes narrowing. "He made me look cold, dismissive, like I don't care." Malcolm nodded slowly. "It wasn't just what he said, it's what people felt when he said it." That stung more than she admitted. She replayed the moment over and over in her head. JD's quiet line, "I come from where America already fell." The timing, the silence, the faces in the audience, and how for a split second her own smirk, captured on national television, made her seem like the villain in a story she thought she was writing. Public sentiment had shifted, not entirely against her, but enough that she felt it in every interview, every question from the press, every subtle narrowing of a journalist's eyes. People weren't interested in policy nuance anymore. They wanted real. And somehow, J.D. Vance had made real his weapon. Still, Warren was no coward. She leaned back in her chair and exhaled sharply. "Fine," she muttered. "We go back, but this time, we control the framing." Meanwhile, across town, J.D. received the same invitation. He didn't need to speak to a press team or workshop talking points. He stared at the envelope, nodded once, and handed it to his staff. "I'll be there," was all he said. No gloating, no celebration, just another obligation in a long string of appearances he never dreamed would matter to anyone. But it did, because since that night, the letters hadn't stopped. From veterans, teachers, grandmothers, factory workers, students. They sent handwritten pages, typed notes, emails with blurry attachments and school photos. They didn't write because he'd won. They wrote because he had spoken what they lived. And now ABC was asking him to return. He wasn't sure what to say this time, or if he wanted to speak at all. But when he opened a letter from a mother in Flint, Michigan, "I lost my son to fentanyl. No one listened until I heard you say we weren't broken. We were abandoned." He folded it carefully, pressed it into his breast pocket, and said to no one in particular, "This one's for her." The stage was being rebuilt, lighting tested, graphics redrawn. ABC's control room prepared for the kind of viewership they hadn't seen in a decade. Two names, one stage, a national reckoning. But something felt different this time. Warren came armed with facts, charts, polling data. Vance came with letters, real people's voices, a folded page in his pocket and a weight in his chest. They were returning not just to debate each other, but to face what they both had missed. And this time, everyone would be watching closer. The lights dimmed once more in the grand ABC auditorium. The air felt heavier than it had weeks earlier. No cheers, no early applause. Just a sea of faces waiting. Not for spectacle, but for something that might feel like truth. J.D. Vance adjusted his microphone, then looked across the stage. Warren's eyes met his for only a second before returning to her notes. The moderator nodded. "Senator Vance, the floor is yours." J.D. didn't start with numbers or a slogan. He didn't raise his voice. He simply began. His name was Harold Dempsey. He worked 38 years at the steel plant in Ironton, Ohio. Longer than I've been alive. He paused. You could hear the hum of the cameras. He clocked in when his son was born, and he clocked out the same week the plant filed for bankruptcy. He lost his job, lost his pension. The benefits they promised him vanished into legal fine print. You know the kind. Contracts no one reads until they are already hurting. Warren's hand holding a pen stopped moving. J.D. continued, voice steady. For the first few months, Harold tried to make it work. He sold his truck, mowed lawns, got a part-time job bagging groceries at 68. A few heads nodded in the audience. And then one night, he left a voicemail for his daughter. Just 4 words. I'm sorry. I'm tired. J.D. paused longer now. His jaw tightened. She found him the next morning, still in his work boots. Gasps flickered through the room like sparks in dry grass. But no one interrupted. Not this time. J.D. placed his hands on the podium. He didn't die because of a lack of progress. He died because progress ran over him and never looked back. Silence. Not polite silence. Heavy silence. The moderator blinked, visibly moved. Warren kept her eyes down, the tip of her pen now resting on the edge of the notepad, unmoving. Even the production crew in the back, trained to be neutral, leaned toward the monitors, breath held. J.D. leaned forward. We throw around words like innovation and globalization as if they don't leave blood on the floor. But Harold's not a statistic. He's a question this country has to answer. What do we owe the people who built it? No slogans, no punchlines. Just that question hanging in the air. A woman in the front row wiped her eyes. A man beside her nodded slowly, whispering something inaudible to his partner. The moment had changed them, not politically, but viscerally. And still, Warren said nothing. She wasn't defeated. She wasn't even angry. She was thinking. Because buried beneath all her policy projections and economic models was the part of her that went door to door in Oklahoma, fighting for single moms and factory workers before she had a title. That part of her had never left. But somewhere along the marble floors of the Capitol and fluorescent halls of academia, she'd stopped seeing men like Harold as real. Tonight, J.D. Vance reminded her. The moderator cleared his throat gently. Senator Warren? She looked up. Her voice came softly. I didn't know about Harold. J.D. didn't smile. He didn't nod. That's the problem, he replied. No one did. Until it was too late. The cameras didn't cut away. They didn't need to. This wasn't theater. It was reckoning. And across America, millions of viewers, especially those in small towns with crumbling factories and fading pensions, sat in front of their TVs, hearing their own grief spoken aloud for the first time. No one interrupted. Because when truth finally speaks, even politics has to listen. The debate was supposed to end with closing statements, 30 seconds of summation, a polite handshake, maybe a headline or two. But after J.D.'s final words about Harold, no one moved. The moderator hesitated, glanced at the teleprompter, then quietly said, Senator Vance, your final thought? J.D. stepped forward, but he didn't look at the cameras. His eyes scanned the room instead. The rows of silent faces, the soft rustle of someone dabbing their eyes, the hum of a live feed that no one dared interrupt. He exhaled and said simply, Some truths don't need applause. They just need witnesses. No catchphrase. No dramatic pause. Just that. The room held its breath. The cameras stayed live, but even the crew didn't dare cut away. It was the kind of silence that didn't beg to be filled. It demanded to be felt. Then came the sound no one expected, the soft click of a pen. Elizabeth Warren set it down beside her notes, lifted her gaze, and, after the longest pause of the night, she nodded, slowly, deliberately. "I heard it this time," she said. Her voice was low, not quite shaking, but stripped of the careful cadence of a politician. "I don't agree with everything, but I heard it." It wasn't an apology, and it didn't need to be. It was recognition. And in that moment, the story wasn't JD versus Warren. It was something rarer. Two people on a stage and one of them finally listening to the other. The moderator glanced toward the control booth, waiting for direction, but no cue came. Instead, he closed his folder gently and said, "That concludes tonight's debate. Thank you for being with us." But neither candidate moved. JD tucked the letter from Flint back into his jacket pocket. His hand hovered there for a beat too long, as if he were still holding Harold's memory by the edges. He gave Warren a short nod, not of triumph, but of acknowledgement, and turned to step away from the podium. Warren didn't follow right away. She remained still, scanning the room the way one might at a memorial, quietly with weight in her eyes. She wasn't watching voters or polling data anymore. She was watching the people whose names she didn't know, but whose pain had just been made visible in front of her. Backstage, an intern whispered to a producer, "Was that scripted?" The producer shook her head. "No, that was real." Outside the auditorium, a group of students stood gathered around a phone, rewatching the clip as it spread like wildfire online. One of them muttered, "I didn't even like Vance." But that hit different. In a rural Ohio diner, an elderly couple sat side by side in silence, both wiping their eyes with napkins they pretended were for coffee spills. And in Kansas, the civics teacher from earlier in the story updated her board. Beneath the quote from JD, "I come from where America already fell," she added his final line, "Some truths don't need applause. They just need witnesses." The chalk squeaked faintly. The students read in silence. Back in the now empty auditorium, two podiums stood under dim lights side by side. No confetti, no applause, no spin, just a nod, and a line that stayed. The paint hadn't dried yet. In a civics classroom in rural Pennsylvania, a new sentence now stretched across the pale yellow wall above the chalkboard. 6 words, jagged, defiant, remembered. "I come from where America already fell." No fancy fonts, just thick black letters and silence. JD Vance entered the room unannounced. The teacher, a young woman in her early 30s, froze mid-lesson. She recognized him immediately. The students did too. But JD didn't speak. He simply sat in the back, in one of the plastic chairs too small for his frame. The kids turned, curious, some wide-eyed. No one said a word. The teacher quietly resumed. Today's topic was representation. But maybe today, we listen instead. JD looked around the room. Posters of American landmarks, a wrinkled map, tattered flags on the windowsill. But what held his eyes was the mural, his words. A boy in the second row, no older than 13, tore out a sheet from his notebook and slid it back across the floor with his shoe. JD picked it up. Just one sentence. "Thanks for saying it." He folded the note, tucked it in his coat pocket, and nodded. No speeches, no cameras, just witness. JD's office had changed. Gone were the framed articles, the polished plaques. In their place, a massive map, nearly floor to ceiling, dotted with red pushpins. At first glance, it looked chaotic. So many towns, so many dots. But up close, it told a story. Ash Fork, Arizona. New Boston, Texas. Ironwood, Michigan. Wilkesboro, North Carolina. Each pin represented a letter, a voice, a place left out of headlines. His staff called it the real America. Under the map stood shelves stacked with envelopes, hand-scrawled and weather-worn. Some came on notebook paper, others on Veterans Affairs forms. A few were written by children, others by widows, ex-factory workers. truckers, retired miners. Every morning they added more. One staffer whispered, "It's turning into a second country." Another added, "Maybe it always was." JD didn't respond. He just pinned another town. Clay, West Virginia. He didn't need to say anything. The wall was speaking now. Snow clung to the corners of Middletown sidewalks, softening the worn edges of brick buildings and rusted signage. JD Vance walked slowly, his collar turned up against the chill, his breath visible in the air. He passed the corner store where he once bought lunch with change, the field where Eli broke his arm on a dare, the overgrown lot where the factory whistle used to sound. A group of kids played football in the cold, their laughter echoing between buildings. JD stopped when he reached the mural. It stretched across the side of an old diner, half faded by weather but lovingly maintained. In the mural, a young boy sitting alone at a desk, a factory in the background, and beside him in large looping letters, "I come from where America already fell." A woman stepped outside the diner, wiping her hands on her apron. "Took us a while to paint it," she said, "but we all knew it needed to be there." JD smiled softly. "I didn't win that debate," he said almost to himself. "I just said what no one else would." She nodded. "That's why it stayed." He walked on. The camera didn't follow. The quote didn't fade. The truth, some truths, don't leave. This story reminds us that truth doesn't always arrive with applause. Sometimes it arrives quietly through the voice of someone who lived it. J.D. Vance's journey, as imagined in this dramatized tale, isn't about political points or debates won. It's about the power of being seen and the courage to speak when no one else will. His line, "I come from where America already fell," resonates because it's not a soundbite. It's a lived reality for countless forgotten towns and unheard lives. What stays with us isn't the clash on stage, but the quiet dignity of those who refuse to disappear. The mural, the letters, the boy's note, all echo the idea that representation isn't about being loud, but about being real. Sometimes the most powerful legacy isn't fame or headlines. It's knowing someone out there told your story when you couldn't. Now we ask you, have you ever heard someone speak the truth you couldn't say aloud? What would it mean for you, or your town, to be truly seen? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. This isn't just a story, it's a reflection. If this story touches you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to JD Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching JD Stories.